is example and practice that brings to life the values and principles that are found in the Quran and the sacred text of Islam. And he is quoted as saying these words, which provide a foundation for zakat distribution. When he was sending an emissary, an envoy to Yemen, which at that time was a province of the city-state of Medina, he said to him these words: "Take zakat from their rich and give it to their poor." In fact, he said, "and return it to their poor." So take from their rich and return it to their poor. Those concepts of return, of who they are, and what rich and poor mean are concepts that I'll explore in this paper. There's another short anecdote I'd like to read to you, which took place about 1,400 years later. And this is from an article that Andrea Elliott, the New York Times reporter, wrote on the attempts of two Muslim communities in the New York area to kind of overcome some of the tensions that had emerged because of the differences in their racial and economic and political demographics in their communities. So Andrea Elliott says this: "Only 28 miles separate Imam Talib's mosque in Harlem from the Islamic Center of Long Island. The congregations they each serve, African Americans at the city mosque and immigrants of South Asian and Arab descent in the suburbs, represent the largest Muslim populations in the United States. Yet a vast gulf divides them, a gulf marked by race and class, culture, and history. Like Dr. Khan, who is the president of the Islamic Center in Long Island, many Muslim immigrants came to the United States with advanced degrees and quickly prospered, settling in the suburbs. For decades, African Americans watched with frustration as immigrants sent donations to causes overseas, largely ignoring the problems of poor Muslims in the United States." So here we have a very different picture of community. Are these two mosques, these two different groups of Muslims living in Long Island and Harlem, are they in fact one community, or are they two separate communities? What does the return of wealth, how should it be interpreted in this very different demographic context? So these are the issues that I'm thinking about, and many in our community are thinking about. It's no surprise that there's a sense of unrealized aspirations with respect to what zakat can do. What I would like to suggest in this paper is that there's, to some extent, an over-emphasis or an unrealistic sense of expectation about what something as simple as an annual wealth tax can do to heal all of the divisions and divides in a Muslim community, and that we should really put it in its place. It can be a very effective and dynamic form of giving that can instigate and support healing, but it in itself cannot fix everything that's wrong in the American political, economic, social landscape, whether that's for Muslims or others. Now, if we just back up a little bit and I give you some of the background, what is zakat? Zakat is a word that means literally purification or growth, and it is a wealth tax. It is not a form of charity, although those who receive it sense it as charity in many cases. But for the donor or the giver, it is a legal obligation. It is not done out of a sense of goodwill or beneficence, but it's an obligation. It is one of the duties that is most emphasized in the Quran, being mentioned dozens and dozens of times and paired very often with the obligation to pray. establish prayer and pay zakat, establish prayer and pay zakat. So these two things go hand in hand, and prayer being the most important ritual obligation that a believer can fulfill. Zakat is due on any form of wealth. It may be cash, precious metals, jewelry, agricultural crops, livestock, commercial and vacation property, collectibles, savings and retirement funds in today's financial landscape. For cash, the rate is 2.5%. For other things that like crops and livestock, the zakat that must be paid is in kind. So you pay crops for crops. But for most Americans, American Muslims, the most relevant figure is this 2.5% on wealth. Now, who must pay it? Zakat is due on wealth that is subject to two conditions. First of all, it must have been in your ownership for a year. So zakat is payable each year. As long as that wealth has been in your possession for a year, you must pay the zakat on it. Second, zakat has to exceed what's called the nisab. A nisab is a minimum amount that is above your needs, basic needs. So once you've satisfied the basic needs of yourself and those for whom you're legally obliged to support, then if you have after that remaining in savings or as a form of wealth, the nisab, you need to pay on that amount. Nisab is 3 ounces of gold. It's one way to calculate it. So approximately $3,000 or so in 2009. That means that a person in America, a Muslim in America who's met his or her basic needs and has a modest savings of $3,000 would be required to pay $75 in zakat at the end of the year. Now, that's interesting because if we remember back to the prophetic teaching at the beginning, the order is to take from the rich and give to the poor. Certainly in today's parlance, individuals who had no more than $3,000 in surplus wealth above what they needed would not necessarily consider themselves rich. But I would suggest that the language is not only archaic, but it's useful in spiritual and ethical terms, because by designating those individuals who have this rather modest amount rich, the teaching can inculcate a feeling of gratitude and blessings among those who have even modest means. And this goes along with one of the prophetic teachings, one of the prophetic ethical teachings, in which the Prophet Muhammad said, when you see one who has more, look to one who has less. Zakat is a tangible manifestation of the feeling of abundance and thankfulness. So although most people will be able to identify many individuals who have more than they do, much more wealth perhaps, at the same time, if they make this movement of looking from those who have more to those who have less, they will move from a feeling of deficiency and lack to a feeling of surplus, gratitude, and thankfulness, and hence the generosity will be easier. Now, who is eligible to receive zakat? The Quran lists 8 categories of recipients of zakat. The Quran says this: alms are for the poor and the needy, for those who work to administer them, for those whose hearts are to be won over, for those in bondage, for debtors, in the path of God, and for wayfarers. Now, some of these categories are unambiguous and easily identified. For example, those who administer the zakat, who are employed in the collection and distribution of zakat, that their salaries can be met, reasonable overhead in the process of zakat and collection and distribution can be taken. There are other categories that need some interpretation by Muslim scholars looking at the context of the revelation in the Quran, as well as supplementary texts that can help us understand the meaning. So, for example, who are those whose hearts what is the meaning of those whose hearts are to be won over? Well, this is a category that was identified as converts, those who wanted to join the community but hesitated to do so because of real social and economic consequences that might happen from leaving one community to joining another. And that's particularly true in a pre-modern society in which religious and political identity tend to be conflated. So scholars have said, they said very early on, in fact, that category no longer was operative, although other scholars disagree on that. One of the interesting points about this verse is that there's a distinction made between the poor and the needy. And scholars spent a long time arguing over the differences of these terms. In fact, sometimes they're translated as the poor and the indigent, and pretty much synonymous terms. But what seems to be at work here, the scholars believed, is that there can be a combination of absolute and relative factors in poverty, so that there are some people who are clearly poor. They cannot meet their basic needs. They do not have shelter. They do not have sufficient food. There are others who have a subjective feeling of need that is justified when you compare what they have to the people around them, to the average person around them. It might be they might have much more than the poor, but there still is a sense of deprivation, which is problematic because the sense of deprivation is something that is considered to be corrosive of the sense of oneness in the community. Now, all feelings of deprivation are not, you could say, justified. Certainly, we should be grateful theologically, according to Islamic teachings, for what we have, yet at the same time, the gap is considered to create a certain kind of instability. But how these will be understood and what particular policies will be applied to assessing who is eligible to receive zakat differs widely across Muslim societies. And that has a lot to do with the fact that the collection and distribution of zakat very quickly fell out of the jurisdiction of the state. Only for the first few decades was zakat, in fact, collected by the state and redistributed. Very soon, people, as much as possible, gave out their own zakat and didn't even give it to sort of local or regional collectors. But there was a sense then, and until now, in some places, especially in some traditional societies, that the sense of giving hand to hand, the sense of being in touch with an individual who's in need is something important. That added to a skepticism about government, a fear of the corruption of government, a feeling that, I think this is universal sense with respect to governments, that if you send it to the capital, who knows when it's going to come back and if it'll be distributed correctly again. I was just reading today in the newspaper that Social Security has now officially, the payouts today are higher than the pay-ins. So we all know the problem about paying money in on the promise that it's going to be redistributed back to those in need. So that's something that clearly comes out in the Islamic texts. So there's two things. One, the emotional and social connection that individuals have when they personally hand zakat to someone in need, and second, the fear that that states simply will not manage it correctly and justly. Now, a final category of the 8 categories of zakat recipients I want to discuss, and this is important for the rest of my talk here tonight about community cohesion, is a general category called in the path of God, fi sabilillah. Now, early scholars said that this category referred only to those soldiers who needed to be equipped and supported to defend the interests of the Muslim community. So it was only for soldiers, those who struggled in the path of God. Within a few centuries, and particularly once Muslim societies had established very significant